Elizabeth I is often remembered as the Virgin Queen, stands as the first truly great Queen of England, not merely because she wore the crown as a woman in a patriarchal age, but because she transformed the very identity of the monarchy, steering her nation from vulnerability into glory during her 44-year reign, a span that came to be called the Elizabethan Golden Age. She inherited a kingdom torn by religious strife, financial insecurity, and the lingering shadows of her father, Henry VIII's turbulent rule, and her sister Mary I's divisive policies. Yet through political shrewdness, charisma, and an uncanny ability to balance competing factions, she forged a new sense of national unity, crafting an image of herself not just as a ruler by birth, but as the living embodiment of England itself. Unlike her predecessors and rivals, Elizabeth mastered the art of symbolism, carefully cultivating her persona as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, whose unmarried status was presented not as a weakness, but as a conscious, almost sacred choice to be wedded solely to her kingdom. And this image gave her unparalleled authority, allowing her to occupy a unique space in the imagination of her people, who saw her simultaneously as a mother figure, a sacred icon, and a warrior leader. Under her reign, England not only survived existential threats, such as the looming danger from Catholic Europe and the terrifying might of Philip II's Spanish Armada, but it thrived, turning defensive victories into triumphant myths that bolstered national pride and legitimized her government. Her triumph against Spain in 1588 was not just a naval battle, but a turning point in European history, a moment where a relatively small island nation defied the greatest empire of the age and emerged as a rising power destined to expand across the seas. Elizabeth was the first queen to preside over such a dramatic transformation, and her ability to project stability while secretly navigating constant crises became her hallmark. She walked a tightrope between Catholic and Protestant factions, between Parliament and her royal prerogative, between noble families whose ambitions threatened the throne, and foreign princes whose marriage offers carried both promise and peril. And she did so with a mixture of theatricality and ruthlessness that underscored her singular genius. Though criticized at times for indecision, her hesitation often proved a calculated strategy that allowed her to gauge the political winds and strike only when the outcome was clear, a skill that kept England largely at peace internally, even as Europe convulsed with wars of religion. Yet her greatness was not confined to politics and war, for Elizabeth presided over one of the richest cultural flowerings in English history, a period that saw William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, and countless others redefine literature and drama, while explorers such as Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh carried English ambition across the oceans, planting the seeds of empire. As the first queen to embody such sweeping change, Elizabeth blurred the line between monarch and myth, her carefully orchestrated progresses across the country, turning her into a figure whom common people could see, cheer, and adore, thereby weaving her into the very fabric of the nation. She was the first English queen to prove that a woman could wield absolute power not as a consort or regent, but in her own right, facing down misogynistic critics who doubted her abilities and proving through sheer longevity and success that her gender was no impediment to ruling effectively. Indeed, her reign redefined monarchy itself, showing that charisma, imagery, and statecraft could be as powerful as brute force, and that the crown could embody both majesty and personal magnetism in ways that transcended bloodline or battlefield. The fact that she never married and never produced an heir, which many contemporaries feared would doom the dynasty, paradoxically reinforced her legend. Elizabeth's fear of embalming was not a trivial or passing dread, but a profound and enduring terror rooted in the brutal realities of 16th-century mortuary practices, and it reveals as much about her humanity as it does about the age in which she reigned, for while she had projected the image of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, radiant in silks and jewels, she was at heart a woman tormented by the knowledge of how violently her body would be treated once her final breath had been drawn. Embalming in that era was not the gentle preservation ritual that later centuries would refine, but an invasive and gruesome procedure in which the corpse was stretched upon a cold stone slab and carved open with long, sharp knives, The chest cavity split wide so that the heart, lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines could be ripped away by hand, and into that hollow shell attendants would stuff pungent herbs and exotic spices, cloves, cinnamon, myrrh, and other costly imports, chosen not for reverence, but merely to mask the foul stench of decay. Elizabeth, who had lived for more than 4 decades surrounded by plots, executions, and the ever-present shadow of mortality, understood that once she surrendered to death, her royal command would no longer protect her, and so she pleaded with her physicians in closest attendance to spare her this indignity, to allow her body to remain whole so that she might appear before her Creator unbroken, unaltered, intact. Yet the inexorable reality of death's aftermath was that her wishes could not be honored, for without embalming, the natural processes of decomposition would have transformed her state funeral from a solemn act of national mourning into a spectacle of horror as swelling gases burst the coffin and leaked corruption into the public eye. Elizabeth's dread was thus not only of pain, though the imagined violation haunted her waking thoughts, but of the humiliation of her body becoming a grotesque display for the people who had once bowed before her majesty. And this fear gnawed at her, even as she maintained her regal composure in public, for she had seen too clearly the fate of monarchs and nobles whose remains, left untreated, erupted in hideous decay, staining forever the solemn dignity of their final rites. Her terror of embalming reflected the paradox of her life and reign. Outwardly fearless, she defied popes, princes, and the might of the Spanish Armada, yet inwardly she trembled at the thought of steel blades rending her flesh and perfumed powders suffocating her emptied form. And in that trembling lay the essence of her humanity. For Elizabeth was not only the embodiment of an empire, but also a woman who yearned, as all mortals do, for the simple mercy of dignity and death. Her resistance to the practice illustrates a striking contrast between the divine image cultivated by monarchs and the grim, material vulnerability of their mortal frames, a contrast that has fascinated generations of historians and writers because it strips away the illusion of eternal power and reveals the monarch as subject to the same indignities as the lowest subject. The Queen's pleas against embalming, though ultimately disregarded by necessity, cast a poignant light on her reign, reminding us that even the woman who shaped the destiny of England in its golden age, who stood as the first great queen to wield sovereign power in her own right, could not escape the deepest fear that lay within her, the fear that death would rob her not only of life, but of integrity, tearing her apart piece by piece until she was no more than a hollow vessel wrapped in velvet and sealed in lead, her flesh a battlefield upon which time and decay would claim their inevitable victory. In contemplating Elizabeth's dread of embalming, one sees the collision between personal vulnerability and public expectation, between a queen's desperate desire for wholeness and the cold practicality of a society determined to preserve appearances at any cost. And within that collision lies the haunting truth that her reign, for all its triumphs, the necessity of embalming in the case of Elizabeth I was never a matter of choice or ritual, but one of grim practicality. And when you look closely at the reasons behind it, you begin to see a chilling picture of what could have unfolded had her body been left untouched. For in the 16th century, the preservation of a monarch was not a courtesy, but a desperate race against nature's relentless clock, a battle waged with knives, spices, and secrecy, designed to prevent the most horrifying outcome of all, the public collapse of majesty into rot. Imagine the scene without intervention. England's most revered queen lying in state for her people to mourn, her coffin swelling as invisible gases built within, the pressure mounting until wood cracked and velvet split, unleashing a spectacle of grotesque decay upon an audience gathered to grieve, a nightmare that would have shattered the illusion of power and dignity her reign had so carefully maintained. Such disasters were not theoretical. History records gruesome instances where royal funerals devolved into horror shows, coffins bursting open mid-ceremony, revealing what should have remained hidden, turning solemnity into scandal. For Elizabeth's court, the stakes were unthinkably high, and so physicians and embalmers, bound not by sentiment but by duty, had no choice but to violate her final pleas, to cut into her flesh, to carve away the organs that had sustained the Virgin Queen through 4.5 decades of defiance and glory, and to fill the void with pungent herbs. their purpose not reverence but deodorization, a futile attempt to outwit the inevitable. They knew what the Queen had feared most, and yet they also knew that without these measures, her last journey through the grey waters of the Thames and into the heart of Westminster Abbey could have ended in catastrophe, her coffin becoming not a vessel of solemnity, but a ticking bomb of decomposition. To investigate this moment is to confront a paradox. The embalming was meant not to honor her, but to protect the living from the scandal of her decay, to guard against the humiliation of a monarch reduced in death to what she had always tried to conceal: human fragility. The process was violent, invasive, utterly devoid of gentleness, a ritual that transformed her from sovereign into specimen. Yet it was considered necessary, almost inevitable, because the alternative was worse. Elizabeth had ruled through terror and triumph, had crushed the Spanish Armada, had held her kingdom together against the conspiracies of kin and foreign crowns. And yet in death, her body became the enemy, a danger that had to be contained, managed, and disguised. The embalming of Elizabeth was thus less about her and more about the state, about maintaining the dignity of monarchy at any cost, about ensuring that her people remembered her not as a decomposing corpse, but as Gloriana, the untouchable Virgin Queen who had steered England into its golden age. What makes this truth so haunting is the cruel irony. Her greatest fear had been precisely this violation, and in death she was subjected to it, her body laid out on cold stone, cut and emptied, the cavity stuffed with foreign spices that could never mask the underlying reality. When the mourners lined the riverbanks to watch her final procession, they saw grandeur, but those close enough whispered of the faintly sickly sweet odor seeping through cracks no eye could detect, a trace of the battle being lost beneath the coffin's lead shell, a reminder that the embalming, though necessary, was never perfect. As an investigator retracing these steps, you see how the necessity of embalming was not a safeguard of dignity, but a desperate gamble, a wager that the lead, the velvet, and the cloves could hold long enough to deceive the public eye. The embalming of Elizabeth I was not the act of honoring a queen, but of preserving a myth, ensuring that England's last Tudor did not explode before her subjects, that her reign ended not in grotesque spectacle, but in carefully staged majesty. The embalming of Elizabeth was not a gesture of reverence or even tradition, but an unavoidable necessity, a grim task undertaken not to honor the Queen, but to shield the living from the grotesque consequences of nature's work. For without it, her state funeral, one of the most solemn events in the history of England, could have turned into a catastrophic display of decomposition and decay, a spectacle that would have haunted the nation and tarnished her legacy forever. The truth of the 16th century was that the human body, left untouched, did not wait politely for ceremonies to conclude. It swelled, cracked, and burst with the inexorable buildup of gases, and in the case of a monarch whose funeral demanded public display, such outcomes were unthinkable. Elizabeth's body, so long the vessel of power, charisma, and authority, had become in death a dangerous liability, a potential time bomb hidden beneath velvet and wood, threatening to rupture in front of mourners, foreign ambassadors, and the very subjects who revered her as Gloriana. Embalming, then, was not an act of mercy, but a brutal form of crisis management, a procedure designed to delay the inevitable just long enough to carry her through the rituals of farewell. Her physicians and embalmers, knowing full well of her pleas not to be cut, had to weigh her wishes against the dangers of spectacle, and in that equation, the state always outweighed the individual, even if that individual had been England's first great queen. The removal of her organs, the packing of her hollowed body with sharp-scented herbs like cloves, cinnamon, and myrrh, was not performed for spiritual reasons or symbolic gestures, but because without them, the odor of putrefaction would have overwhelmed the solemnity of her procession. Imagine, as the mourners lined the banks of the Thames, thousands watching in silence as her barge drifted under gray skies, the horror if instead of grief they were met with the stench of corruption, the sight of a coffin splitting apart, the sacred illusion of majesty collapsing in full view. Such disasters had befallen others before. History recorded the gruesome accounts of coffins that exploded mid-ceremony, of velvet wrappings soaked through with the fluids of decay, of mourners forced to scatter as dignity dissolved into a ghastly spectacle. The embalmers knew they carried not only knives, but the fragile weight of reputation, and so they defied Elizabeth's terror of mutilation to ensure that her final farewell did not descend into chaos. In this lies the bitter irony of her death. Her greatest fear was to be cut and opened, yet without that very violation, her final act as queen would have been remembered not for grandeur, but for horror. The embalming itself, harsh and invasive, was an attempt at control, but even then it could not fully suppress the truth of mortality. Those who stood close enough to her coffin whispered of a faint, sickly sweet odor, a reminder that the embalming was a stopgap, not a solution, a temporary disguise over the relentless work of time. And yet, in the eyes of the state, it succeeded, for her funeral unfolded with majesty intact, the illusion of unbroken sovereignty preserved until the very end. The necessity of embalming Elizabeth reveals the collision between symbolism and reality, between the myth of eternal queenship and the undeniable fragility of the human form. It was an operation not of reverence, but of desperation, a grim duty to keep the Virgin Queen's body from betraying the legend she had built in life. To see this necessity clearly is to understand the cruel paradox of monarchy. The body of a ruler was never entirely their own, not in life and certainly not in death. Elizabeth's embalming was not a sacred rite, but an act of containment, a sealing of dangerous truths behind the walls of a coffin lined with lead. The decision to place Elizabeth in a heavy lead-lined coffin was not a mere flourish of regal pomp, but a calculated act of necessity. For in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the materials chosen for a royal burial were as much about containment as about majesty, and the choice of lead represented a fusion of symbolism, science, and fear. Lead, with its dense and malleable qualities, was regarded as the ultimate safeguard against the volatile forces of decomposition, capable of sealing in odors, gases, and the slow leakage of decay. And in Elizabeth's case, this was paramount, for she was not only a monarch but a myth, and myths cannot be permitted to burst, leak, or crumble before the eyes of the living. The state, still reverberating from her death, was determined that her funeral should affirm continuity and dignity rather than reveal the fragility of the flesh that had once embodied Gloriana. To a historian, the symbolism of this leaden shell is haunting. It was a vessel designed not only to preserve but to imprison, a barrier between the sacred and the profane, a wall between the enduring legend of the Virgin Queen and the inexorable collapse of her human form. Within its dark confines, Elizabeth's body, emptied of its organs and stuffed with pungent herbs, lay swaddled in crimson velvet embroidered with Tudor roses, and though her mortal remains were already betraying her, the coffin gave the illusion of permanence, a silent promise that decay would be kept at bay, hidden, contained. Yet lead was never perfect, and the whispers of her contemporaries, noting the faint sickly sweetness that clung to her barge as it traveled down the Thames, remind us that even the heaviest of metals could not fully silence the body's rebellion. What the coffin did achieve, however, was to buy time enough for the elaborate processions, the solemn ceremonies, the theater of monarchy to play out without collapse. Historians have long noted the irony that Elizabeth, who so carefully cultivated her image as untouchable, eternal, and even divine, was in the end dependent on a man-made shell of metal to preserve that illusion. The lead coffin thus becomes an artifact of paradox, embodying both majesty and vulnerability. For while it elevated her funeral into a spectacle of order and grandeur, it also silently testified to the fragility that all monarchs, no matter how powerful, could never escape. In the centuries that followed, when her tomb was opened during the Victorian era, witnesses reported that even this mighty container had warped and buckled under the slow, inexorable pressure of internal gases, its integrity compromised by the very forces it had been meant to suppress. And in that image lies a profound metaphor. Even lead bends before time. To study Elizabeth's coffin is to study the interplay between human ingenuity and the inevitability of mortality, between a state's desperate need to preserve appearances and the body's stubborn insistence on returning to the earth. The lead coffin was heavy, expensive and deliberate, an object that signaled both reverence and dread, a recognition that Elizabeth's corpse was simultaneously sacred relic and dangerous problem. Its weight reflected not only the density of the metal, but the burden of history itself, the attempt to smother decay beneath layers of mineral permanence. And yet, no matter how carefully sealed, no matter how richly wrapped, the coffin could not ultimately prevent the truth that all flesh fails, all barriers crumble, and all rulers, even the Virgin Queen herself, must bow to the relentless dominion of time. The burial of Elizabeth was marked not only by the grandeur of state ritual, but by the palpable, almost oppressive weight of her coffin, for the lead-lined container crafted to preserve her body was so extraordinarily heavy that it transformed the act of interment into a spectacle of human struggle, a final reminder that even in death the Queen's presence was monumental and unyielding. Accounts speak of the difficulty faced by pallbearers and gravediggers alike, straining under the sheer mass of the coffin as it was borne through the solemn streets of London and eventually lowered into the vault at Westminster Abbey. And this physical burden carried a metaphorical weight as well, for Elizabeth's reign had spanned over 4 decades, shaping the destiny of England, and now her mortal remains demanded an effort equal to the magnitude of her legacy. The imagery of men groaning under the leaden sarcophagus resonates with historians as a symbol of the Tudor state itself, which had long labored under the Queen's formidable will, and now, in death, was called upon once more to bear her immense influence. The ceremony was carefully choreographed to project majesty, but within the cathedral's dim light there lingered a haunting sense that the coffin's immensity was not merely material, but also symbolic, as though it embodied the vast accumulation of years, victories, compromises, and burdens that had defined her rule. In the silence of the Abbey, the final lowering of that coffin was a slow, precarious task, with ropes creaking, earth shifting, and all eyes fixed upon the gaping grave, as if the very weight of the Queen might defy gravity itself. To the historian, this moment is charged with significance, for the drama of lowering so heavy a coffin reveals much about how Elizabeth's subjects perceived her. She was Gloriana, yes, but she was also a responsibility, a monumental figure whose memory pressed down upon the nation just as tangibly as the lead pressed upon the arms of those who bore her. The difficulty of her burial thus becomes a metaphor for the transition between eras, the physical exertion of consigning her body to the earth mirroring the political and cultural labor of moving beyond her reign into the uncertain dawn of Stuart rule. Some chroniclers noted how the massive coffin seemed reluctant to be received by the earth, as though Elizabeth herself resisted burial, clinging to the stage upon which she had so long performed, and this reluctance resonates with her carefully constructed image of eternal virginity and undying sovereignty. Indeed, the heaviness of her coffin carried an aura of permanence, as if England itself would never fully be free of her shadow, and in many respects it never was. For centuries of poets, dramatists, and historians returned again and again to the Virgin Queen as the embodiment of national identity. The effort to bury her was thus no ordinary act of interment, but an enactment of national history, a ritual that merged physical strain with symbolic meaning, and the Abbey's stone vaults, echoing with the groans of men and the chants of clerics, became the setting for a moment that fused myth, memory, and muscle. The heaviness of the coffin remains an image lodged in historical memory, not just as an anecdote of practical difficulty, but as an allegory of Elizabeth's reign itself, grand, weighty, formidable, and almost unbearable to those tasked with carrying it forward. When the ropes finally gave way and the coffin descended into its resting place beside her half-sister Mary, the sound of the stone lid sealing the vault reverberated like the closing of an age, the heavy clang of history itself being shut away, yet never entirely forgotten. In the dim, echoing vaults of Westminster Abbey lies a tale as paradoxical as it is poignant, for beneath the cold stones of that hallowed ground rest side by side 2 women whose lives had been defined by rivalry, suspicion, and ideological warfare. Elizabeth the Foreigner and her half-sister, Mary Leave. To the casual visitor, the shared tomb might appear as a gesture of unity, a symbolic reconciliation beyond the grave. Yet history tells us otherwise, for in their lifetimes the two queens represented opposite poles of belief, ambition, and governance, and their uneasy cohabitation in death feels more like an irony of circumstance than an act of peace. Elizabeth, the Protestant Virgin Queen, the radiant Gloriana who forged an English identity steeped in independence and maritime ambition, had spent her reign erasing the shadows of her sister's Catholic persecutions, reshaping the kingdom in her own image, and casting Mary's reign as a grim interlude of fire and fanaticism. Mary, by contrast, had viewed Elizabeth as a threat from the start, the illegitimate daughter of Anne Boleyn, a usurper in waiting whose very existence undermined her authority, and her attempts to imprison and intimidate her younger sister left scars that Elizabeth would never forget. And yet, in the Abbey, their remains lie together, as if the stone vault mocked the passions that once divided them, as if death itself had woven them into a single narrative of Tudor womanhood. The historian cannot help but dwell on the strangeness of it. Two queens who fought so fiercely for religious supremacy now share the same sacred space, their bones mingling beneath an effigy that proclaims a unity neither ever sought. The decision to enter Elizabeth with Mary was not, after all, the Queen's own wish, but rather the choice of her successor, James I of England, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, who had his own designs upon legacy and symbolism. By placing Elizabeth alongside Mary, James asserted a dynastic continuity, binding the fractured Tudor past into a single chapter and smoothing the way for his Stuart inheritance. Yet the irony lingers in every whisper of the Abbey's stones. When one stands before their shared resting place, one cannot help but imagine the silent dialogue between the sisters. Mary, who had clung to Rome, might resent the Protestant hymns sung above her tomb. Elizabeth, who had celebrated herself as England's eternal virgin and mother of her people, might chafe at lying forever beside the woman whose reign she had taken such pains to eclipse. Their shared grave, then, is less a symbol of reconciliation than of the relentless hand of history, which gathers foes and allies alike into the same earth, indifferent to the battles they once waged. And yet there is also something hauntingly poetic in their proximity, as though the Abbey itself sought to remind England that its identity was forged not by one woman alone, but by the clash of two sisters, two faiths, two visions of monarchy, each shaping the other in opposition. Mary's fires gave Elizabeth her image as deliverer. Elizabeth's glory cast Mary as a dark foil, a warning of tyranny overcome. Now, in death, the two rest as unwilling partners in the making of England's story. For the historian, their tomb is less a site of rest than of tension, a stone chamber vibrating with unresolved conflict, and every visitor who pauses before it steps into the very heart of the Tudor paradox. The marble effigy above speaks in smooth, reconciliatory tones, but beneath the slab the bones of two women remind us that history is never so neatly arranged, that enmities do not dissolve with death but linger in the tales we tell, the comparisons we make, the shadows we conjure when we speak of Mary and Elizabeth. It is perhaps fitting, then, that their shared grave should draw the curious, for within that dark vault lies not peace, but a story of rivalry that refuses to rest, a story that reminds us that the making of a nation is not the work of harmony, but of conflict, contradiction, and uneasy coexistence. In the middle of the 19th century, during the reign of Queen Victoria, an extraordinary episode unfolded within the hushed stone-lined chambers of Westminster Abbey, one that revealed not only the passage of centuries, but also the frailty of monuments that had once been designed to outlast time itself. And it was Dean Arthur Stanley, a man deeply invested in both the sanctity and the historical value of the Abbey, who undertook the inspection that would yield one of the most unsettling reports about the final resting place of Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, whose life had been a stage of triumph, conflict, and enduring symbolism. When Stanley examined her tomb, he found not the unblemished and noble image of royal permanence that posterity might have expected, but rather the stark, material evidence of decay. For the wooden structure of the coffin had already rotted away into little more than fragments of dust and splinters. The rich velvet that had once covered it and proclaimed Elizabeth's regal dignity had turned to threads of dust and mold, while the leaden shell, meant to preserve the Queen's remains against the ravages of time, had warped and buckled as if time itself had mocked the conceit of human craftsmanship. And this discovery was more than the mere record of physical collapse. It was a revelation of the futility of mortals who believed they could command eternity with metal, fabric, and ritual. Elizabeth's death in the early 17th century had been staged as the grand finale of a glorious reign. Her embalming, her leaden coffin, and the solemnity of her interment in the Abbey, all underscoring that her memory was intended to last for all ages. Yet the Victorian investigation showed with unflinching clarity that even the mightiest Queen of England could not command the elements, nor prevent the silent encroachment of decay. And in this paradox lay a powerful symbolism. For Elizabeth had built her image upon permanence, her portraits carefully crafted to show an eternally youthful face, her speeches designed to echo down the corridors of history, her body encased in rituals meant to hold corruption at bay. Yet when Stanley looked upon her grave, he saw the cruel inversion of that image. Velvet in tatters, wood disintegrated, lead distorted, and what remained was not majesty preserved, but majesty undone, reminding Victorians that even sovereigns fall victim to the inevitable march of time. And in this realization, they also found a haunting kind of poetry, because while Elizabeth's body and her coffin disintegrated beneath the Abbey floor, her legacy had only grown in stature, her reign celebrated in books, theater, and legend, and thus the very ruin of her coffin became an emblem of historical truth that flesh and fabric perish, but stories endure. Moreover, the 19th century was an age of scientific curiosity and historical investigation, and Dean Stanley's report did not merely serve as a macabre curiosity, but became a kind of historical testimony, one that spoke to Victorian anxieties about mortality, preservation, and the fragility of human memory, and many who read of his findings could not help but feel the resonance between Elizabeth's crumbling coffin and their own civilization's struggle to preserve itself amid industrial change, political unrest, and the advance of modernity. For if Elizabeth, the formidable monarch who had once commanded empires and defied the might of Spain, could not resist the corrosion of her coffin, what then could the ordinary person expect from death? And this tension gave the discovery its remarkable cultural power. Victorian writers and historians drew upon it to illustrate moral lessons. Artists invoked it as a reminder of the vanitous theme so beloved in earlier centuries, where portraits of power and wealth were accompanied by skulls and hourglasses to remind the viewer of mortality. And in the Abbey itself, the knowledge of the ruined coffin became part of the silent drama of the place. In contemplating the remnants of Elizabeth I's tomb as revealed in the 19th century inspection by Arthur Stanley, one is confronted with a hauntingly paradoxical scene in which the ruin of material grandeur is counterbalanced by the survival of symbolic emblems. And in this paradox we perceive the essence of the ninth point, the lingering traces of royal magnificence that refuse to vanish entirely even under the pressure of centuries. For while the coffin itself had succumbed to the steady and merciless advance of decay, its wooden frame rotted, the sumptuous velvet that once signified regal dignity reduced to powder, and the lead casing warped and broken by time's unyielding hand, there still endured fragments that spoke unmistakably of majesty. Chief among them, the emblem of the Tudor rose, stitched in faded but discernible form, a flower that had for generations stood as the dynastic symbol of reconciliation and power after the Wars of the Roses, and which in Elizabeth's case had been transformed into a personal icon of her sovereignty. Alongside the rose were found remnants of embroidery, threadbare and delicate, the fragile testimony of artisanship once employed to glorify the Virgin Queen's image and authority. And most poignantly, the initials E.R., Elizabeth Regina, faint yet still legible, serving as a textual affirmation of her identity and reign. And thus these relics, insignificant in scale but immense in symbolic weight, provided a bridge between the physical dissolution of the monarch's earthly remains and the immortality of her legacy. For it is precisely in the survival of such details that we see how Elizabeth continued to assert her presence beyond the grave. These scraps of velvet, warped strands of thread, and faintly marked initials are not merely archaeological curiosities, but active conveyors of cultural memory, whispering across time that once here lay a woman who ruled England for more than 4 decades, whose reign oversaw the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the flourishing of Shakespearean drama, and the consolidation of Protestant identity. They remind us that even when marble effigies weather, coffins crumble, and pompous funerary rites fade from recollection, symbols retain their potency, and in fact grow in resonance when set against the backdrop of loss, because the contrast between the ruined coffin and the enduring emblems intensifies the meaning of those emblems, making the Tudor rose seem less a mere dynastic badge than a flower blooming defiantly in the soil of history. The embroidery, not a decorative flourish, but the voice of vanished craftsmen still telling of Elizabeth's grandeur. The initials not letters, but a monogrammed defiance of oblivion. For historians, such survivals offer both a melancholy and an exhilaration. Melancholy in their reminder of decay's triumph, and exhilaration in their ability to resist erasure. And thus Elizabeth's tomb, even in its state of collapse, operates as a text to be read, one in which the faded symbols are the enduring lines of a chronicle written not on parchment, but on fabric and lead. A chronicle that insists Elizabeth's reign cannot be entirely swallowed by the grave. And so the 9th point crystallizes this insight, that the Queen's royal magnificence, though stripped of its physical splendor, lives on in the stubborn persistence of her insignia, which in turn demonstrate how monarchy, unlike mere mortality, seeks to project itself into perpetuity through signs and symbols. And indeed, for Elizabeth, who so carefully cultivated her image in portraits, pageants, and rhetoric, it seems fitting that even in death the vestiges of that image, stitched roses and embroidered letters, should survive to bear witness, as if she herself had anticipated the judgment of posterity, and ensured that some visible mark of her authority would remain, a reminder that while flesh perishes and coffins collapse, the aura of sovereignty endures in fragments, in initials, in roses, and in the imagination of those who uncover and interpret them centuries later. The 10th point, that haunting reminder of the supremacy of time over all earthly power, finds its fullest expression in the crumbling tomb of Elizabeth I, a structure once meant to embody eternal dignity, but now instead serves as a sober lesson that no matter how vast the authority, how enduring the legend, or how carefully wrought the symbols of monarchy may be, they are all eventually subject to the quiet but inexorable dominion of time. And in reflecting upon this truth, we must recall that Elizabeth, who reigned over England for 45 years, guiding it from turmoil into an age of relative stability and cultural flourishing, was a woman who embodied both the grandeur and fragility of human ambition, her every decision echoing through court chambers, her every gesture replicated in portraits designed to immortalize her as Gloriana or the Virgin Queen. Yet behind the paint and gilded wood, the ceremonies and proclamations, lay a mortal figure who could no more resist the march of years than any of her subjects. And so when we turn to her tomb, battered by centuries, with its lead warped, its velvet rotted, its wood long decayed, we are confronted not merely with the disintegration of material, but with the symbolic collapse of royal permanence. For here is the stark demonstration that while Elizabeth's image may have once commanded reverence and fear, her body and the container meant to preserve it succumbed inevitably to decay. And this dissonance between the enduring myth and the fragile reality is what transforms her resting place into a meditation on mortality itself, where the once bright emblems of her reign, the Tudor rose, the monogram ER, the embroidered remnants of a cloth meant to signal splendor, persist only in fragments like whispers of authority that linger after the voice has gone silent. And this state of affairs compels us to acknowledge that time, that ceaseless force which topples empires and erases certainties, has triumphed over a monarch who once seemed above the reach of fate, reducing the queen who defied the Spanish Armada and ruled with an iron will into dust and memory, leaving future generations not with the spectacle of her dominance, but with the fragile ruins of her coffin, which now serve as a mirror for all who gaze upon it, reminding us that power, however immense, cannot guard against oblivion, and it is in this transformation of a regal burial into an allegory of impermanence that the tomb of Elizabeth I transcends its original function, ceasing to be merely a monument to a monarch and becoming, instead, a universal symbol of the futility of resisting time, as if to say that the greater the height of earthly majesty, the more poignant its eventual fall into silence, and historians who study her reign and legacy cannot help but feel the weight of this lesson, for every success she achieved, every enemy she vanquished, and every myth she carefully cultivated has been reframed by the slow, steady erosion that has left her coffin a ruin. And this fact, more than any jewel or crown, teaches posterity that even the Virgin Queen, who embodied for her contemporaries the eternal strength of England, was finally but human. Her body surrendered to the same dust as her people, her monument surrendered to the same corrosion as lesser graves, and thus the tomb does not diminish her memory, but rather elevates it into a deeper category of reflection, transforming Elizabeth from a figure of untouchable majesty into one of profound humanity. For in her decay we see our own, and in the ruined coffin we are reminded that time's ultimate sovereignty renders all hierarchies equal, collapsing the distance between ruler and subject, between conqueror and conquered, between Elizabeth Regina and the countless unnamed souls who lived and died under her rule. And it is this stark, humbling realization that time reigns where monarchs falter, which makes the condition of her tomb not merely a curiosity of history, but a profound statement on the fate of all human endeavor.